Hello. Hello, Chelsea. Hello, Martin. Oh, we can't see us yet. Let me just sort that one out. There we go. Hello, Chelsea. Hello, Martin. Nice to see you both here today. So today is a live chat with Chelsea Sexton of FullyCharged and also very famously EV1. And Martin heard that I had Chelsea on and was a little bit excited and said, "Can you join me?" And I thought, well, he's just done 900 podcasts, so I can't turn the man down, can I?
I couldn't resist.
So, how's it? How are you both today? I got a little bit of admission to make. I accidentally sent Chelsea the wrong day. So Chelsea actually turned up here yesterday for the chat, and me and Martin weren't here because, Dummy here said the wrong day.
No worries at all. It's lovely to be here now.
Yeah, so we've got some pre-submitted questions which we'll get to, but the live chat will be running all the way through this as we're talking live. We'll take super chats first and then any other chats, but we'll try and get to as many questions as possible. We're going to go through a couple of subjects. Obviously, we're going to talk about the EV1. We're going to talk about FullyCharged. I think we should also talk about some of the cars that Chelsea's been lucky to see, like the Rivian and the Cybertruck and some other stuff. So, firstly, Chelsea, obviously we know you're best for Who Killed the Electric Car,
Yes.
and many would hail you as the saviour of the EV1. But
we didn't really save so many. I'm not sure that we saved any, but there are still some out there, which is a slightly different topic.
Yeah, but you attempted to save them. I mean, what actually?
Oh, we tried hard. We tried hard, and actually, that was the second electric car that we tried to save. So originally, the movement, as it were, goes back decades, but that particular phase of it started with a handful of drivers that actually rallied in support of an electric pickup truck called the Ford Ranger. So the EV1 was actually one of the only small cars in that 1990s generation. Most of them were pickup trucks and SUVs. And so some drivers who didn't want to give up their trucks rallied and held a vigil and ultimately saved their trucks and a few others. And at the same time, all the other manufacturers were doing their thing too. And so EV1 kind of became the next thing. And we knew that 78 of them were being held in Burbank, which is about an hour north of where I'm sitting, in a parking lot. And so we started staging a 24/7 vigil, hoping to draw enough attention to similarly get GM to go, okay, fine, you guys can keep them. And of course they did not. But along the way, Chris Payne had been thinking about making something, but wanted somehow to tell the story. And so we had already done that funeral because we figured even if you think we're the crazy ones, it's a really interesting story. And, of course it got plenty of media attention, but the story was EV drivers bid fond farewell and get ready for hydrogen, which of course was very much not the story. So along the way, he just sort of kept a camera around the whole time and ultimately decided, well, maybe I'll make a movie. And that took 5 years. And, we figured we'd burn copies for our parents and move on with our lives. But ultimately, some other people got involved and Sony Pictures bought it and it went into theaters and we all were very shocked, but it's been quite an adventure ever since.
What actually made you want to take GM on? To basically try and save the EV1. What's kind of your motivator there?
Yeah, there's nothing that made me want to take GM on because ironically, I was and remain one of the shyest people in our little movement. And so I have always proceeded from the standpoint of, well, no one's really noticing what I'm doing. And all of us proceeded from the standpoint of not having a huge laid out path. We just have to figure out what to do today and what to do tomorrow. And that still is really, really important because these things are kind of daunting in a David versus Goliath sort of way. But when we started the vigil, it was just, hey, if we can help bring a little bit of attention to the story, that was the important thing. It completely flabbergasted me when somebody figured out there was a former GM employee in the mix, and that also became part of the story. But we'd been there for weeks without anyone really noticing that, and in fact, it took a couple weeks for anyone to notice we were really there at all, unless you happened to drive by and see us with signs. So yes, that part was all a giant shock. And even when Chris made the movie, I had seen rough cuts, I had seen advanced screenings, and I wasn't in it at all. And that was kind of the arrangement we'd made, is I'll help you as long as I don't have to be in it. And he kind of went, I don't want you in it anyway. But we did a quick little interview at the very end. And, the intention was to use a few seconds of it. I saw a version of it. I wasn't in it at all. It was all fine. And then we got into Sundance. And so a few dozen of us activists went to Sundance just to watch it. We were so excited. And that was when I learned I was actually in the movie. With my husband sitting next to me going, "Oh my God, your head is so big." And ironically, he's in it too. And he gets noted, he actually gets recognized more.
Wow.
But yeah, it was an interesting family project for a while.
Why were you so passionate about, because you were 20, this was one of your first jobs, selling electric cars, but what made you back then? Can you put your finger on why did it push your button, and why did you feel passionately about this car?
Yeah, I started selling gas cars at the age of 17. Not because I was into cars. I didn't grow up that way, but I have what my mother describes as a pathological self-sufficient streak. So I started selling cars to pay for university. And a few years into that, I was selling Saturns, which at the time was a progressive brand, no haggling and all sorts of fun things. A few years into that, one of my managers at the time came to me and he goes, "Yeah, you know that electric car GM's been talking about? They're hiring some people to help with that program. And I think you have to be an electrical engineer, so you probably won't qualify." I was still in university at the time, but you're such a nerd. It probably would be up your alley. You should look into this. And so in a rare moment, I did. And luckily, you didn't have to already be an electrical engineer. And I struck 2 deals in order to take that job. One of which was I didn't have to quit college, and the other was I didn't have to move to Michigan.
Yeah.
And moved over purely for the nerdiness of it. I liked the technology and the engineering, but then I drove one for the first time on the back roads of Tennessee and found out that I liked torque and horsepower more than anyone rightfully should. So my original draw was engineering, and it still is largely, but I also really like the performance aspect of them. And at the time, and still, it was like, okay, by the way, they're environmentally clean. That was not the main driver for me personally, and it was not the main driver for California, which was air quality driven, but not climate change driven at the time. We had a smog problem, an asthma problem, a lung condition problem, but it wasn't climate in the same way that's the conversation now. So a lot of these things have evolved.
They were so expensive, though. $600 a month to lease. And were people just walking in off the street inquiring, or how did people did they advertise? There was one advert I remember where all sorts of electrical appliances like lamps and microwaves kind of came out of their house in the middle of the night. I forget the commercial, and lined the street.
Right.
And the car drove down, and they surrounded it. But did they push the car hard in the beginning, or, because it was an expensive car to lease?
Well, we had all sorts of pricing. It started at $600. We actually adjusted really quickly, figured out that was not right. And also we were, ironically, at the time, there were 13 people that were tasked with putting this car on the road, on the front lines. That's it. So we each had a little geographic territory, but there was no siloing back then. So in theory, we were marketing people, but we all had contractors' licenses because we helped install all of the residential and public charging at the time. GM paid for half of the public charging at the time. We taught the DMV how to register an electric car versus internal combustion. We helped write the incentives. And so we did a lot of that work along the way as well to help bring the price down. So ultimately, most of them leased for about $349 to $399 a month, which is not an obscene car payment here. At least.
Yeah. One of my favorite stories, talk about everyone being a kind of jack of all trades, is that you would even go and, is this right? You would move people's cars around for them to, because like it had, I remember when Tesla introduced pin to drive as a kind of safety feature a couple of years ago, a security feature, and everyone lost their minds about how brilliant Elon Musk is. And I'm thinking, 20 years after you had pin to drive.
That's true. And we did a recent episode that I got to play with an EV1 and show some of that. But yes, it was the first, at the time, pin to enter the car was not entirely new. There were some other products that did have that, but we were the first sort of actual, there was no key to start the ignition, even if the battery ran dead. So you had a code, and you inputted that, and that's how the car started. And so as a result, and being such a customer service driven project and company, because it was still distributed through Saturn, which was known for that customer service, I live very close to Los Angeles International Airport, and we put some chargers in at the time, but even back then there were never enough. And so people would leave me, voicemails. I'm on this trip, I'll be back on this day, and I am that much of a nerd that I would go down and move everybody's cars around, because I had all the master codes to all of them, and make sure everybody was charged by the time they came back. And there was lots of things like that we did that provided all sorts of lessons that still are applicable to this day, but that most companies don't really want to hear that much.
I mean, it was really quite a pioneering car. So, I mean, I saw that episode that you did for Fully Charged, and if anyone's not seen it, it is well worth a watch. Really, really good video, which talks about how you got it there and some of the tech behind the car. Do you want to just tell us some of the most pioneering things that were on that car that have now translated onto EVs today?
Well, I think, since Steve showed it, everyone should just go watch it. But at the end of the program, so the backstory on that, at the end of the program, about 30 to 40 cars were sort of gutted and donated to museums and universities. And the universities are allowed to rebuild them if they want to, as long as they don't ask GM for parts and they don't register them to run on public roads. But they can use them for engineering projects. That was entirely the point at the time, was for kids to learn from them. And a few of the universities have rebuilt them, but now, let's face it, it makes more sense to get a used Leaf or something to learn on. This is not really the right thing anymore, as much as I understand completely. Everyone wants to put a Tesla drivetrain in an EV1. But the local Electric Auto Association EV Owners Club in Oklahoma knew that there was one there. And so they actually got permission to borrow it from Tulsa Tech, who was amazing in allowing their car to be handed over to this group of advocates. And we ended up towing it down to Fully Charged Live in Austin with an Audi e-tron, because the idea snowballed and became like, what if we could tow an EV with an EV? And public charging is built out just enough in that area that we could do it. And Electrify America was cool and getting involved. And Audi was all in on, yes, we'll provide you a car and come along and help support this. We think this is great and awesome. And so while I had access to the car, and Tulsa Tech was so cool about letting me crawl all through it, they totally didn't care. They understood completely that I am more cautious around that car and more protective of it than they will ever be. And so I took the opportunity to do a little walk around and point out some cool features of like the pin to drive, goofy things, the radio antenna, the inductive charging, the magic button under the dashboard that recharges the 12-volt aux battery off the traction pack that I can't believe every electric car has not implemented to this day. So you never have to call roadside assistance if you leave your headlights on. Some interesting things back then that were brand spanking new. Some today have been regen braking have been implemented and are not uncommon, but a few still are kind of uncommon.
Yeah, so it was one of the first cars, I think, with flyby braking and flyby.
Oh yeah, brake by wire, steer by wire. Yeah, those things actually were, and even the tire pressure monitoring system, which today is on every car. There were only a couple versions of it at the time, and the EV1 was one of those.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about all the technology that was built in that car, you can see why GM were trying to market at such a high price, because it was just such a revolutionary car. But I mean, I don't want to say too much, because otherwise people won't go and watch the episode. And I really do think they need to watch it. How many times have you been sent this picture?
Oh my God, a million.
Do you know the story behind it? Can
yes, I do. Yes, and it's one of those 30 to 40 gutted cars. It was donated to a university in Georgia, and it has obviously been sitting in a parking garage for quite some time. I've now seen several iterations of that picture over the years. So every time it's got more dust on it, and I have the backstory I've gotten on it basically is that that particular department ran out of funding to do much with it, and so it's kind of just been sitting. And the nature of the agreement is that universities are not allowed to resell them. They're not allowed to dispose of it. Basically, if they want to do anything with the car, they have to contact GM first and give them the option to take it back. And of course, GM will. And so that car's been sitting. And so I've seen lots of people go take selfies with it, and it gives me kind of mixed feelings, because on one hand, I like that people enjoy that it's there. Of course, I share the feeling on I'd like to see it in a better home. I'm a little nervous about if the university gets too much flack, they're just going to call GM and get rid of it. So I have been entertaining, and I've started to float the idea by GM of figuring out how to do something with it in a way that won't bother them so much, but gets it in a place where it will be protected and enjoyed by those of us that want to. So I see all the grassroots, let's just go steal it ideas, and I'm the one going, no, please, no, it'll cause more harm than you mean.
I mean, it's such a massive, company that the all big companies have, so many chefs. Everyone will have an opinion inside the company. But to the best of your knowledge, like, what is the corporate feeling about EV1 now? Has enough time passed where they're willing now to start thinking, let's celebrate it rather than crush it?
It varies by person. In my experience,
of course,
yeah. And so collective, and I mean, I understand it, and I'm one of those people that's like, let me help you figure out how to walk this line. On one hand, there are folks that appreciate it, and certainly appreciate the fans that they had, and I think that's part of it. So there are certain executives, past and current, that understand the engineering lead that they had, and there's a little bit of that, like, yeah, we don't really want to talk about it that loud, but we know we kind of gave away our lead. There are others that look at companies like Tesla and go, but we had that first, and we gave that away too, because there's a certain amount of EV fandom that is about the technology itself. So as much as that irks some of the fanboys, Tesla does not corner the market on all things EV fandom, but certainly they have additional layers around the company and what it's about that enhance it. All of that existed on EV1 first. And in fact, when I first met Martin Eberhard and Mark Tarpening, who are actual founders of Tesla, I used to tease them, your customers tomorrow were mine first. And many of them were, especially on the early Roadster. So I think there's multiple layers in which GM kind of gets that. They also strike me as a little nervous to talk about it, because depending on how they raise it, from my standpoint, they should be proud of the legacy. But every time they raise it, it's, shame on you for killing it. So there's, it's a double-edged sword, and I understand that. But I also, every single time, challenge them to get over it. If I of all people tell people not to hold that grudge, they got to get past it too. And it is part of their legacy. And there are a number of components on the Bolt and the Volt and, cars that are coming that were pioneered on that one, and that they continue to work on even when they weren't selling EVs. So they have to figure out how to tell those stories.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is they've got to be careful talking about it. If you look from their commercial standpoint, because someone did a really big movie about it, so it might look really bad on them if they start raising too much awareness around it and people start.
Well, they like our second movie much better, though.
Yeah. I mean, time is a great healer, so hopefully people over time will, be able to admit. A lot of big companies, when enough time passes, can say, "Look, we got it wrong, but we're making it right," and they are making it right now. And they and certainly with the cars coming out over the next X many years, they will be making it right. So it'd be so good if they could embrace that. Because I think if you did a straw poll of, the woman or man on the street, and you just said, "Hey, electric cars," first word, they go Tesla, right? And so, but as you say, it'd be so cool if GM could embrace that history of theirs, so that they, not to say, hey, we got there first, we're better than blah blah blah, not a fight, but just to get some credit for the amazing work they did back then. And look, and all companies do the best thing they can do at that time with that management. So at the time, it was the right thing for them to do. You might not agree with this, but like, they made that decision. Like, we live with it. Like, they did that. They made that decision. Companies do stuff that we don't agree with. Companies will do things in their own interest. So, but also management changes and people change, and
that's a lot of it too on the grudge holding. Those that are there today are not responsible for the decisions that were made yesterday. So, and frankly, I don't begrudge GM the decision, like all of the other automakers. Let's face it, it was the 3 main Japanese companies and the 3 main American car companies all killed and crushed their electric cars. GM had the most rabid fans among that group, in part because some of the others mostly sold to fleets, and so there just weren't as many individuals involved. But in all of them, there are some engineers that remain, but the engineers were always on our side and are still on our side, and that's fine. Most of the executives have changed, and some of the new ones understand that whether or not they think it was the right thing to do, they don't want to go back there. They get that they don't want to repeat that mistake. And much of the mistake was not the killing, as much as, that was a self-inflicted wound. So the killing of it cost them the leadership standpoint, and yes, to some degree, a larger climate effect we can debate now. But at the same time, the dishonesty, it was the cover-up. It wasn't the crime, it was the cover-up, as is usually the case. them coming out and saying nobody wanted one. If they had just said, we've made a business decision to end this program and we'll pay whatever penalties to CARB or whoever we need to pay, but we're going to move on, we would have all been bummed, but there would have been no movie, there would have been no movement. All of those things that actually cost them more would never have happened. It was the, gosh, we tried so hard, but we could not get anyone to want one of those electric cars that ultimately did them in. And those are some of the lessons that need to be considered now as well.
Yeah, it's a bit like holding VW to task for the emissions scandal.
Right.
Eventually, we've got to realise that the people who are in charge who did that are not there anymore.
Right.
VW want to embrace their electric future, and if we carry on not allowing, at the end of the day, Tesla, in Elon's own words, they can't make every electric car for the planet. They can't.
And even if they could, there is no single kind of car for everyone. We all have brand affinities. We like this style over that style. So we need all hands on deck. And I don't agree with all the decisions that GM or anybody else is making today. And we can talk about those, but I'm not judging my current opinion on GM or anybody else on decisions made 20 years ago. And I encourage anyone else to not do the same thing. There are more current decisions that we can base our opinions on, and everyone's making those as well. But yeah, I mean, we got to move on.
Yeah.
And if we consider anyone beyond redemption, that's not helpful either. So I always guard. I mean, I understand boycotts are popular, but I hate them.
Yeah.
If you tell a company, no matter what you do, we'll never buy your product, what's their incentive to do better? I'm the one that encourages, you should call them and tell them what you want. And tell them, I will give you my business when you build me this thing that I want. And we have evidence where that has changed the strategy of GM, but also others.
Yeah. I mean, it's like Toyota, for example. I mean, I don't know if they do it in the US, but over here in the UK, when they advertise electric cars, hybrid cars.
Self-charging hybrids.
Yeah, that's it. So it's big self-charging hybrid, the way they advertise it over here, which is, it's awful, but eventually they're going to make a full electric car, which they have, I think, in China. We're going to have to embrace them. You're going to have to support them because the people have brand, like you just said, brand affiliate. They want to buy that brand.
Yeah, well, and I'm not as much of an EV purist as some of my brethren. So I appreciate the role of decent plug-in hybrids. And, I was not to some degree, I will, my balance is I will never challenge a driver on what got them to buy something with a plug in the first place. Because getting something with a plug is the biggest step in growing the community. I will persistently challenge automakers to make them better cars. So I think there's a place for really robust plug-in hybrids. The Volt was one of them. The Honda Clarity, even though it's really low volume, the plug-in hybrid version is one of them. And I think the RAV Prime is one of them. So I'm encouraged to see Toyota walk upwards in that path. I am discouraged by the fact they're only making 5,000 of them. So there's still other aspects we need to deal with. But as a car, I think it's actually kind of promising. To some degree, it's kind of a U.S. problem, but it's also not just a U.S. problem. There are lots of areas that have more rural drivers or, folks that don't have as much built out infrastructure, a variety of reasons that if we can get them a car that 80% of the time is an electric car, I am less concerned with that last 20% in the near to midterm. There's a point at which we can talk about that crossover for purity, but I'm happy to see Toyota walk along that path. And the plug-in Prius was not that. So they've learned quite a bit in the last 10 years. But self-charging hybrids are still crap. And so is the Nissan e-Power Note by extension. So they market that one as, all the benefits of an electric car, and it's a serial gasoline-only hybrid. And when I challenged them on that, their head of comms at the time in Japan said, well, but no, it's a translation of a Japanese press release. And of course, my response is, it's still a lie in Japanese. Yeah. So, and these things are not, I get that a lot now too, of people going, but no, that's a UK ad. The borders are not so staunch anymore. There's this thing called the internet, and a lie is a lie, no matter where you tell it.
How do you view your sort of your position in the community? Because as you say, you didn't want to be in the first movie, and then you went to watch it, and you were, obviously pre-social media, and then as social media came around, and you had more of a profile. How do you see that position that was almost, did you embrace it? Did you feel that it was inflicted on you because you were this central figure that people would look to through your knowledge and your passion? And how do you feel about it now?
I try to think about as little as possible. Yeah, it was the experience at the time was very much frying pan to fire. And so on one hand, it was super uncomfortable, but at the same time, we had spent, by the time the movie came out, I'd already been at this for, 10 or more years. So, we'd spent so many years trying to get anyone to be willing to have this conversation at all, that how could I not be grateful that more people wanted to have that conversation? And that remains true. And I often joke that I'm kind of the grout between the tiles in some ways, and a little bit the pot stirrer. I've been independent for a lot of years now. And so, but I have a background in working for an automaker and helping to start nonprofits and venture capital and public advocacy and all sorts of different things that enabled me to do a lot of translation between the sides. And because I'm independent, I can get away with asking questions than employees can sometimes. I get some of those notes too of, yes, please, I'm happy you told my boss that, because I say it too, but he hears it from you and he doesn't hear it from me. And so whenever I can enable some of that, that's a good thing. And I still spend most of my time trying to enable electrified transportation, whether cars or bikes or transit or whatever. So advocacy and advising and a little bit of consulting to pay the bills, all things sort of media are more still moonlighting. They always have been. So they're not my primary thing, but where I can help get good stories told, whether it's through FullyCharged, or I occasionally write an article when something gets under my skin, or transport Treehouse from my little house during these pandemic times, that's where I have sort of embraced more of that. It's less new reviews, because lots of people do that. It's more, what are the stories and what are the topics that aren't getting talked about enough, and who are the people involved that aren't getting enough attention? That's more my interest, in challenging some of the double standards involved in all of this and things like that.
So a lot of people probably don't know, but you're quite highly involved in Electrify America, aren't you? Did you help set it up? Something along those lines?
I did some initial consulting for them as they were establishing that company. So I had previously worked with some of them at Audi on the go-to-market strategy for the e-tron SUV. And then to your point about some of the people involved in Dieselgate are not the people involved since, Electrify America was largely, and remains largely, not former Volkswagen people, but a couple of them, while everyone was still working for their original jobs, were tasked with figuring out how to start Electrify America. And so I was an early advisor to a lot of that in the formation of the company and the strategy, and I still pester them incessantly about different topics.
How do you think they're doing?
I think public charging is more challenging than folks realize. There's nuts and bolts of land acquisition and weird stuff like that. And I think I challenged both sides on the provision, the cost of all of these things. On one hand, yay, they've built out a huge number of stations in a short amount of time. I also still challenge them, and frankly, every other public charging company, around creating a more user experience centered point of view. I don't think any company is really doing right by the drivers yet on that front.
Yeah, they're even replacing some of the early hardware, and I say early,
which is good, because it's
only a couple of years old, but it was unreliable. So I think that they're doing the right things, and I think a couple of weeks ago, a month ago, over Labor Day weekend, they then closed an entire route to upgrade them.
That was maybe poor timing, but the right thing to do, but you didn't think that. But I don't know. I'm not sure if it was the EA's decision or probably the contractor they hired.
Yeah.
Yes, Labor Day weekend was not the right, or not the ideal choice. At the same time, we're all still basically working from home, and I can see no one's going to take a road trip holiday yet.
Apart from tens of thousands of people on I-95 that would quite like to charge, please. But it just seems like some of those decisions that they made, they're making right, and some of them still. But look, we're thousands of miles away.
Which is true for every single company involved. So that's it. There's stuff I appreciate that they do and like that they've done. There's stuff I don't think you're quite there yet, and so because I know some of them, I tend to pester them, and they will be the first to tell you that.
Yeah, but look, they're spending. So to put it, as you say, to put a charger in, it's not just the charger, which if you are talking an HPC or a 350 kilowatt is fabulously expensive to buy the hardware. But also, if you want 4 of those, and you want
your megawatt transformers and conduit and all of those things, plus the land acquisition. Because in many public charging sites, the most valuable thing is the parking space.
Yeah.
And so you also have to acquire that land or lease it or sublease it or whatever the case is. So yes, these are really expensive and complicated propositions, really. It's not just the money involved, it's all the different entities involved, the utility company and the landowner and the retailer and etc.
But not only that, it's also getting in the services. I mean, you have to factor in, is there enough capacity of the grid, or is there enough electrical wiring in that area to put those charges in? Right.
Well, and that's, I mean, a lot of us think that, I will only speak for myself. As much as I appreciate, Ionity and EVgo and ChargePoint and Electrify America and all those guys that are sort of focused primarily on fast, primarily highway dominant, but sometimes urban charging, there's also still quite a bit of room for level 2. AC charging, passive charging. I feel like the DC conversation has gotten too much focus, and we're too focused on the depot model. And I get it. There's people want to take road trips, and yes, many of us live in multifamily dwellings and haven't been able to do charging at home, things like that. And I can do charging here now, but I was in an apartment for all of my EV1 years. I totally get it. But charging a car should be more like charging a phone than filling a gas car. And I feel like we're too centered on the thing that we're used to and forcing future mobility to behave like past mobility too much of the time, and that we're giving up some of those more passive, more convenient opportunities. That there's all speeds have their place. Any speed in the wrong place is catastrophic, but as long as we put the right speed in the right place, that helps affordability, that helps grow the movement, that helps adoption, all of those things.
Funny enough, I've not posted it yet, but I've just recorded a video saying exactly what you just said, that AC shouldn't be forgotten. I always make the analogy that charging should be a bit more like cow grazing. We should just graze on a little bit of grass there and a little bit of grass there.
I've always framed it as grazing versus gorging. Gas cars, you drive till empty, you fill to full. EVs are mostly the opposite.
Just quickly, I just jump in. Whose job is it to educate the buyers, though?
Everybody's.
Yeah.
Well, yes, because here's the challenge. For as long as EVs have been around, the core industry, the automakers, have been mostly ambivalent about doing it. And they mostly still are. And certainly some of the startups are more into it, but don't necessarily have the capacity. And the incumbent industry, some are more into it than others, but by and large, none of them are looking to really displace their gasoline stuff today. And so they're not doing as effective job as we'd like. So for 25 years, this has been a community advocate, enthusiast, happy warrior driven movement. And I include the happy warriors that are involved in these companies because they often have helped drive things forward. Yeah. So we don't have the luxury of saying whose job should it be. It is all of our job.
Yeah, nice question that come here off Dean. So he wants to know what do you reckon the most important thing we can do to speed up EV adoption right now?
Depends on who's the we. So the single thing facing EV adoption is lack of product, lack of volume, lack of variety, lack of geographic distribution. So not enough things available in enough places. People cannot buy what's not available. The number 2 problem is lack of awareness. So, you can call it education, you can call it marketing. It's people can't buy what they don't know about or what they think is slow and pokey and like a milk float or a golf cart. So, if an automaker does it, we call it marketing. If an advocacy group does it, we call it education. But it's basically the same thing where we have to get more of that out there.
That's been the case forever, though.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm not saying these things are new. I'm saying they're persistent.
But why are they changing? In 1997, Top Gear, Gear, as people think of Top Gear, which is Jeremy Clarkson, etc., that is should be referred to as new Top Gear because they reinvented the format.
Yeah, I'm familiar. That dude came to... I was there that day when he did that.
But old Top Gear, which was very much BBC. Now we will review a car, everybody. It was so I say Top Gear, but in case any viewers aren't I think I'm not talking Jeremy Clarkson Quentin Wilson, who is a great journalist and a massive EV fan. okay, so let's not hold him to account what he said 23 years ago. But like the film they made, which was all about the car, all of a sudden at the end of it, he's like, I'm 19 miles away from getting the car back and I've got 20 miles on the dash. This is the most stressful drive of my life. And you're like, I know, because I've worked in the media for years, that's storytelling. If you want to get back with more miles to spare, don't tell that story. But that was the fashionable story to tell in 1997. And to an extent, but why is it still cool to go, oh, EVs are rubbish?
I think people like to be contrarian.
Okay.
I mean, there's some of it that is just basically that of you think yourself more of a journalist if you poke holes in the thing, whatever the thing is. And sometimes that's fair and needed. And sometimes that's just, it's clickbait. It's. I mean, that was sort of an old school version of clickbait.
Yeah,
and
it was like 90s clickbait. Yeah.
Right. And you know, he came to Los Angeles, and I'm the one that had to hang out with him for a day. So I mean.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. When I say I was there, I mean that episode.
You were literally there. Yeah. So and can you
Probably
hear them
huddled behind his driver's seat on that little package ledge, because that's how I did most of the media things, was behind with 2 seats.
Like, could you hear them, what they were saying and talking to the camera? And did you feel like just speaking up and going like, no, that's wrong? Or like, were you there to woo the media and you had to keep your mouth shut and you were young and these were the big media coming in?
I don't know that. I mean, in some ways, I was young and therefore, and we had not yet been media trained. The only media training I've ever had, GM provided, but not until we started doing recalls.
Yeah.
So at the time, there was no specific mandate. We were just there to help and provide information. So, but not to challenge, but not to enable either. And I had not a lot of, it was like, yeah, okay, fine, media. I didn't really have a huge opinion of like, oh, those are the big media. I can't talk to them. I talk to everybody.
Yeah.
So, I mean, certainly on camera, I wasn't going to be the one to jump into their shot and go, damn it, you're saying it wrong. In fairness, that car, look, the Gen 1 EV1, in real world miles, we advertised 70 to 90. It was a 50 to 70 mile car. I mean, you could milk it for more. Hypermiling started on that car. But it was a car that bred some range anxiety. So I didn't want to give crap to the media that said so, because it wasn't an unfair statement at the time. We had 3 versions. The Gen 2 car, the lead acid version, went 120 to 140 miles, and the nickel metal version was more like 140 to 170. And because I like the torque thing, I managed to hold the longest and the shortest range records in
well done. Well done.
I know how to drive them when I want to, but when I don't have to. So yeah, obviously those things changed, and those statements bothered us a little bit more on Gen 2 than Gen 1. And I still notice it's a funny moving creep thing where forever it was like 300 miles is the bogey, even though my blast gas car won't go that far. Now that there's companies doing 300, 500 is the new bogey. All of those things will remain true. And some of it is the psychology of charging. I mean, we get obsessed with the vehicle, but some of it's the psychology of charging. If you don't already have an EV, you don't understand how much of the charging is passive. You're used to gasoline only being able to charge in public or refuel in public. So that's part of it too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like that statement that Robert retweeted only a couple of days ago, which is, I have to do 900 miles a day while towing a horse box, and never got time to stop, and I've only got 2 hours to do it in.
Right.
People always will find that ceiling. Question just come up there, Plug Seeker. He's just put a super chat in, so he's just put OEMs are losing money from post-sale repair service on EVs because obviously they do tend to be more reliable. How do you think? I
don't think they're losing money yet, but
yeah. How do you think OEMs are going to adapt to this sort of money-making model?
I mean, so they will. So 2 things. One, it is not nearly as big of a problem as our first movie popularized. I mean, my husband was the dude at the end of that first movie going, here's all the parts that EVs don't use. So I get that it's a conversation. To date, I have yet to meet a dealer owner or general manager that is concerned about it. Literally, they're not. It's just, it's some version of, yeah, fine. But even in a place like Los Angeles where growth is high compared to the middle of the country, it's still not happening fast enough to really displace their internal combustion business in real time. And so therefore, like, I'll be a retired, that's the next dude's problem. But also some industry specific things around trying to get enough heavy line technicians to really do some of that work anyway. And so, from the standpoint of, can I service more vehicles with less staff through a smaller footprint, lower real estate? That's not entirely bad either. So some of it's really industry specific things that all that end up to, they're not freaking out about this. That said, automakers and some of the dealer groups are thinking about how to adapt should this become a thing. And that will manifest in different types of aftermarket products, different types of warranties, different, more companies I see are gravitating towards over-the-air updates, but all of them may be free, including from companies like Tesla. It's like, okay, fine, I'll save you the convenience of going to a dealer, but you're going to still pay for this enhancement thing that you want. Some are hiring electricians on staff to help people put in chargers if they're in an area that have a fair amount of EV sales. So is that thought going into it, and should? It's one of those things where these are all fair questions, but let's not freak out about them at the same time. Let's sort of rationally consider them.
Do you think a possible plan for them to, if it does ever become a concern, is the subscription model which you saw of the car in California?
Subscription models are interesting because there's so many versions of them right now. So we see everything from sort of companies like Canoe that imagine you subscribing to a car, which I mean, on one hand, I love to see more EVs become available. I'm not sure that I challenge them. The subscription model is not that much different than leasing today. People are used to paying a monthly payment. And so the main difference is if you want to terminate early, you don't have an early termination fee. But otherwise, I think some of the subscription models are overblown on how radical they are, even if there's some more minor benefits. But I also see automakers trying to figure out how to do sort of features as a service. So subscribing to a feature in a car you might otherwise acquire through more traditional means. And certainly there's some questions to which, the market will accept that. So more software-based things, there seems to be some acceptance. More hardware-based things, the market is more challenging of. And even Tesla saw a little bit in that when, they had 60 kilowatt-hour batteries, they would dial back to 40 and make you pay to unlock. And to some degree, the consumer response was, if it's already in my car, I don't want to have to pay more to use it. And I helped an automaker with focus groups once that invited some Chinese focus groups, and they were very candid around, we'll just hack that. Like, we're never going to accept something like that. So it remains to be seen how they all adopt that kind of a model in ways that also the market will accept. I know Cadillac is going to try it on Super Cruise and things like that. So we'll see.
Yeah, it's an interesting business plan. Like you said, to me, obviously I'm from the car trade as a salesperson, I just see it very, very, very much exactly the same as leasing a car. Just like you said, with no early termination fees. There's a company over here in the UK will actually rent pretty much any electric car to you on a month-by-month basis. You just rent it for a month and take it back. And that's not manufacturer specific. You can rent a Tesla, you can rent BMW, a Zoe, pretty much any car. But I think the subscription model is interesting. BMW, I think we're thinking about subscribing to heated seats. And I used to be an i3 owner, so I got many jokes sent to me about subscribing to the indicators as well.
Right. Well, sure. Yes.
Can I ask a question?
I won't comment on BMW owners and indicators.
Can I ask a question on startups? Who's getting it more right than wrong at the moment in terms of the new companies around?
I think folks are. Rivian, of course, is very fascinating, and
even though they've not produced a vehicle for any customer yet.
Well, yes, and so in fairness, I'll say getting it right for the stage that any of them are in at the time. I certainly. I get the Tesla folks that are like, they all suck because until they've done what Tesla's done, but Tesla's been at it for 15 years. So if we're fair, we evaluate them for the stage they're in and kind of how long they've been around and what their public statements are. And that's a big thing as well. So Rivian, of course, is the one that everyone's very excited about, and they've raised so much funding that they have some nice runway there. And also having spent some time in their headquarters with their people and seeing one of the I look for goofy things when I'm looking at the startups. And so I look for, who's there, where they come from. When I started to see more people that I know from other car companies migrating there, it was like, okay, I see they have some solid engineering cred, people that I've known. That sort of thing is always helpful rather than you look at their LinkedIn and there's like not a single person you've ever heard of or that come from the space. That raises more concern. But something I appreciate about Rivian and also Lucid actually is their humility. They're not over-promising at this point. Their general point of view is, we don't get to get shouty until we've put stuff on the road. And that's refreshing in this era of startups.
Probably Peter Rawlinson's most common comment at the launch of the Air was, and he said it several times to make the point, and even in the Q&A afterwards, he kept saying, until we deliver a car, we haven't achieved anything. And but whilst also having, you know, that whole intro to the sequence was about the team members and the team, and so you know, he's obviously there say, look, we've done a lot, but there's you know, a lot still to go. And then how do you feel about the heat around EVs? Because you know, there are certain companies, and I'll name them so you don't have to.
Is that a thermal management joke?
Yeah, okay, I'm going to go with it. I'll take the credit for that. But there's I'll take Nikola as an example that have produced nothing, that have a former CEO and executive chairman that has now left the company, that has cancelled the unveiling of their car, which was meant to happen this year, and yet they have so many people talking them up, going, you know, either investing, or I don't want to get into the whole investing thing, but just like, not only have they not made a car, but also I'm just a head scratcher. But they're not like they're the high profile one, but there's lots of heat in the EV world at the moment, and people are throwing money at it, and it seems to be a 2020 thing. How do you feel about it? Seems to be like the fashionable de rigueur thing to do is just throw money at the EV thing.
Well, this is easily the third or fourth iteration I have seen of the throwing money at the EV thing to some degree. Cool. So after the incumbents, the first wave of there's been startups for forever, but the first wave of throwing money at it was sort of the mid 2000s straight up venture capital firms. And so, you know, Tesla was one of them, and I was advising one of them. And so I introduced them to Tesla, and that became their first EV investment. Better Place was also one of those, not my idea. And then the quote rival firm, the other one that was very well known at the time, invested in Fisker and in Think. And so there was that era of all of those big Silicon Valley venture firms wanted an EV company. And so there was that. And some of them worked out better than others, but that was kind of the first phase. Then we also have seen what I call the Chinese American hybrid companies, which is Chinese funding, American based. Faraday Future was kind of the first one of those, but also Byton and NIO, and for a while Lucid was that, even though they've switched their funding now. And so we had the Chinese firms throwing money at EVs phase, and now this is certainly the summer of SPACs. And so all these companies that are going public through SPACs, and you know, the degree to which we can draw credibility conclusions from that, I think many of us do, but certainly that's the latest way to do it. And so we're in a bubble of valuation. And certainly that's true for Nikola. I'll say out loud that they have just not passed my sniff test.
Good. I didn't want to tempt you into dissing them.
I'll say it. Yeah. I mean, I appreciate what they're doing. I often, whether it's incumbent car makers or startups, the analogy I use a lot is that it's like raising children, at least for me, because it's one of those things where you root for them to succeed, of course, but the fact that you want them to succeed doesn't keep you from seeing them for who they are, including their strengths and weaknesses. And I feel that way about every single one of the startups I walk into, even where I have friends there, and same thing about the incumbents, even where I have friends there, even where I think their idea is fine, but the team's not, or funding's not there, or whatever, I can see there's a little bit of bless your heart, I'd love for you to succeed, but I also very much see what you're up against. And that's true for every one of these companies involved to varying degrees, and they all have, some of them have consistent weaknesses, but there are others that are different. But Nikola is the precise opposite of a Rivian or a Lucid or somebody like that, where you can point at Rivian and Lucid and say, but they've not built anything, but they're also not claiming otherwise. They're not shouting, and that's often the difference, where when the claims vastly outweigh the substance, that's where they get off track. And I think many of us we're exhausted by some of the ego involved, and I think that's hurt Nikola in some ways as well, where it's exhausting. And I get that Elon and to some degree Trump have kind of popularized that general personality, but I don't find it helpful, and it doesn't impress me, and usually it works against you.
No, and as you say, RJ and Peter Rawlinson, they've got a very different way of going about their business and quietly getting on with it. And we're in a very difficult phase where those cars aren't on the road yet.
Right.
But
well, I mean, in fairness,
Lucid
Lucid is a different animal than Rivian, and they've had several pivots, and they've been around a very long time, and they have very different pots of funding to deal with, and so I'm not even trying to pretend that they're all in same boats, but that general, humility versus ego tug of war is informative.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see when they finally get it out. You're one of the very, very, very few people who've actually seen the Rivian and also seen the Tesla truck.
I was not at the Tesla unveiling. Oh no, I was there, but I didn't go up and really climb.
Oh, did you know?
I did Rivian. Rivian, I climbed in the tunnel and everything. We didn't do that on Cybertruck.
Cool.
Did you do the EV1 pose in the tunnel? Did you?
Just about.
Cool.
Cool. I'm known for crawling in trunks and tunnels and anything I can test that way.
Me and Martin were we severely disagree on something on the on the Cybertruck on the unveil, and that is when this happened.
Yeah.
And I'm personally in the ballpark that it felt a little bit of a setup, and Martin's in the ballpark that it was a mistake. Where do you sit on it?
I mean, I certainly at the time I assumed it was a mistake. I also get the all press is good press and the spin that will happen afterwards. The most interesting thing to me about that event, though, was, it was very unusual for a Tesla unveiling. It was smaller, it was nerdier, the Blade Runner theme, all of that, people in costume, and even the other journalists and I were sort of debating as we were waiting to be let inside around whether or not it was going to result in a real production vehicle along the lines of Model S, Model X, 3, that kind of thing, high volume. And of course, I was the one arguing that no, it's not. It's just look at the theme here. But also to end up in the back corner of the room, everybody in front of me, and they went from, in the span of like a minute, from "Oh my God, I love you, Elon, will you marry me?" shouting at the stage, to that truck rolling out and an audible going across the room, and then watching all the cell phones come out. Everybody checking their Twitters and text messages to see if everybody else had the same reaction. It was fascinating to watch. And by the end of the event, the vast majority of people did not think this was the real truck. And everyone was waiting for the Steve Jobs moment, the one more thing, where he'd roll out the real thing at the end. A few people thought, I don't care what it is. If Elon makes it, I will buy it. And a few ended up in this is definitely still not the real thing, but we won't see the real thing till later camp. So, and a few that thought he just lost his mind completely.
I was watching it live, and then when he said, "Oh, just one more thing," and I thought, "Oh, here we go." And then it was the little quad bike.
And then the Yamaha rolled out.
Yeah.
It was a real shock. I mean, I had a funny story about that day. I believe you were struggling to get in with your cameraman.
Yes.
And you got some help off a fellow YouTuber at the time, and I'll get you in.
Which was awesome.
Yeah. If anyone's not seen that FullyCharged episode, you should go check it out.
We have the luxury that it's especially in the US, because I'm the only US presenter, but I have an actual camera woman, because I am not one of those people that's good enough to shoot things on my phone. So the only reason our quality is as good as it is because I have an actual professional. So the notion of only me getting in and having to try to shoot something there was not tenable. And we were very lucky to have somebody volunteer his +1 to my camera person.
Yeah, I mean, something that I found out, because I speak to the FullyCharged team quite a lot. So I spoke to Dan Caesar, and I said, "Oh, how did you recruit Chelsea?" And he kind of told me. He says, "Oh, we've still never met her." and this was obviously before Austin. And he's like, "We never met. We just told her what we wanted. She sent it, and we could not believe how good it was when we got all the footage." Then this was obviously the first video you sent over, and they were just. It just seems so weird that the show was put together. You had the whole sort of aspect as if it was a FullyCharged show, but you'd never actually met anyone on this side of the
Well, so I've known Robert for like a dozen years, and we met because when he was doing Carpool, his little online show, before Seinfeld co-opted it, where he'd drive somebody around and interview them. He'd done that online for a while, and then he came to the U.S. to film a few episodes, like in 2008 or something. And so he and I did one then, and that's how we met. And we hit it off, and we just kind of got along. And occasionally when he would come out for something else, we drove to CES in Las Vegas in a Cadillac ELR once because he wanted to do something that was EV oriented. And so I did that as a guest on Fully Charged. And so we just sort of knew each other, but I hadn't met the rest of the team. And again, the shy thing, Dan had asked me if I would help do moderation and stuff at what was planned to be the first Fully Charged, which ended up being delayed, for reasons having nothing to do with COVID. But at the time it was supposed to be like almost a year before. I said, yeah, sure, fine, I'll help do that. But then later, almost a year ago now, or just over a year ago, Robert pinged me and said, I'm supposed to go do this episode with Lucid, and it's like a week out, and I have a conflict, and I just can't do it. You're already in California. Can you try? Can you just go do this and see how it goes? And that was I did that, and then somehow I'm a presenter. So that was entirely the conversation. It was not unlike the film. There was no real advance conversation around what that would look like, how to do one. There was zero guidance whatsoever. And now there's 6 or 7 presenters, around mostly Europe and England, a little China as well. I am the only non-professional presenter in the bunch. I'm just the EV nerd, and I think that shows in some ways. I think it has advantages and disadvantages, but it mostly means I show up and nerd out with whomever I'm in front of, and the results are what they are.
I think that gives it a better presence. I think the reason why people watch YouTube channels and stuff like that is because they don't want that too polished TV. They kind of want it a little bit more honest, a little bit more truthful. And the thing is, you're going to ask questions that presenters would not ask because you're an EV nerd. Yeah,
I try. In fact, I think I'm among the editing team. I think I'm mostly known for doing really long interviews and then having to wade through all the footage. But I end up talking to everybody for as long as they are willing, trying to get any new information I possibly can. We were lucky enough to go spend a day at Rivian headquarters, and by the end of it, RJ is pulling me into the lab going, come look at our propulsion system and come see how we designed our kitchen and all these things that ended up not making the episode. But at the time I'm thinking, this is really cool and clever, and I haven't seen this in every other article about this company, so I'm just going to keep on going. So yes, my enthusiasm hopefully helps compensate for any of my non-presenter deficiencies.
There's going to be some interesting vehicles coming soon to Europe, mostly from China, but are Americans going to buy Chinese EVs, or do they prefer European and homegrown?
That remains to be seen. Actually, so this little transport treehouse thing, you've watched one episode, but I recently did one with Michael Dunn, who's known to be sort of the Chinese expert, American-based in our space, and we had exactly this kind of conversation and ended up mostly agreeing that we thought the same thing. I don't think Chinese companies primarily are going to focus on the US and Europe anytime soon. They're too busy serving the domestic market. But in both cases, there's also this Chinese company aspect. And it's one I've been thinking about even in the last administration, before all of the current geopolitical hassles, around the notion that it took 20 years for Japanese car companies to be taken seriously here, and then 20 years for Korean car companies, and Chinese companies potentially hold more baggage than those did at the time. But there's still always an aspect of like, it's unfamiliar. And certainly Chinese product has not historically aimed to please American or European markets. So there's a point at which I think they absolutely will try to aim for that. I don't think it's going to happen very much for the next few years. I realize there's a few Chinese companies that have sort of gone public on our stock exchange, but I don't see many vehicles coming here. What is fascinating for me to watch, though, is what I call the Trojan horse companies compared to the perceived as Chinese companies. So Volvo, Polestar, Jaguar, Land Rover, all Chinese Indian companies, but not perceived as such because they're familiar brands. None of them are super high volume compared to Chevrolet or Ford, but they are not perceived as Chinese or Indian cars, no matter where they're built or who funds them. So the degree to which companies sort of note that and navigate accordingly, I think will also influence their success. There's also lots of Buicks that are built in China and some that are actually brought back here, and a few Cadillacs that have been historically, and no one cares about that either. The brand ends up mattering more. And so in both cases, in both of our markets, I think that will ultimately be one of the challenges.
Yeah, and the new BMW iX3 not being sold in the US, sadly, is only made in China. So, and then exported back to Europe. And the rumors at the moment are that Giga Shanghai could well be making Model Ys for Europe. I don't know if I fully sign up to that. And you know what? As long as the quality is good enough, I don't really care where the car is made. I care more about the security and safety of the car. And that leads us on to the connected issue. Of course, EV1, early EVs weren't connected cars. Tesla largely get the credit really for connecting EVs. But going forward, I certainly want to be able to get in my car, talk to my car, tell my Amazon device or my Google device to play my driving playlist or add a reminder to my calendar or all those kind of things. But all of that means that my data is sitting somewhere. So personally, I start to think, well, I just want to know that that is secure. And I think the whole TikTok storyline has made people question, well, where is my data being stored? And so maybe that'll be the differentiator. I don't know.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see. On one hand, I realize that in the more current version, Tesla is seen for that. But let's face it, all cars, all of their companies have more data on you than most customers really understand. And things like OnStar helped, they were the building blocks of telemetry and connectivity long before any particular EV came along. So this has been a long time in the making. And on one hand, I think people are concerned. On the other hand, there are a lot of people that are not that concerned. But also the balance ends up being, do I derive enough of how I subjectively define value to worry about it? So, we can argue that every single person on Facebook is making a specific choice. And same thing with other companies. And so, the degree to which this will matter because Chinese will matter to some, but I think we're also oblivious to how much of that is already going on. And at the end of the day, if they perceive value, they might not care.
Okay.
So, and that remains an open question too for sort of Chinese cars. Do they try to come in? That was what the Koreans did. They came in at a price and with a warranty that exceeded everything else, and people kind of went, I'm going to take that chance. It remains to be seen how China navigates that. And I think the hurdles will be higher in some ways, but I think also with enough focus and decision, they could convince enough people that it won't matter.
Yeah,
we're not all nerds.
Yeah, weirdly, I'm not a big fan of fully connected cars.
I don't talk to my devices. I'm one of those people that has never used Siri. I have never spoken to my car.
Just don't say the A word because you'll set off hundreds of houses.
I chat away to her all day. I've got one in every room.
My husband is the same way. So in the man cave where the video games are, he's got all the spoken devices, and in this room where I tend to live, none of them.
No.
Yeah, I'm not. The reason I'm not a fan of connected cars is I just don't like the idea that a manufacturer has control of something that you've bought, an asset that you own, and can randomly decide what part of that asset you can use. There's a story about a YouTuber called Rich Rebuilds over in the States, and he was talking about like salvage cars, for example. So they've turned off the supercharging ability on his Tesla, which, fine, it's Tesla's network, it's part of their terms and conditions, great, I can get that, that's understandable. But it also means he can't use, the other chargers, other CCS chargers, which that's not their stuff. They don't, I don't think they should have any access to turn that off.
Well, and all things, that's also somewhat of a separate issue involving right to repair. Yeah. But yes, Tesla has, over the years, been fairly prescriptive on this front, even going back to Roadster days. And on some level, I understand it. And it's certainly earlier on. It was the same thing with Leaf drivers that wanted to replace their packs. And Nissan was very concerned when they developed the battery replacement program that packs might end up out there in the wild somewhere. And frankly, if someone does something stupid and gets killed, the story is not someone did something and got killed. It was a Nissan Leaf battery caught fire, or a Tesla, or whatever. So that was the origination of a lot of it. The degree to which that remains the right thing to do, and the subjectivity depending on the car involved and how damaged it is a more complicated topic. But I get it. And battery leasing has never been a thing here. But I know that, Renault has, and others have played with battery leasing. You can buy the car, lease the car, and then lease the battery separately. But an aspect of that means if you miss a car payment, they can break your car, the finance company. So some of those things are happening regardless of how connected the car is from the aspect that you're talking about. I mean, that remote capability is, again, more built in than most people realize.
Yeah. Me and Martin actually both own a leased battery Renault Zoe.
Well, there you go. Don't miss a payment.
I got no problem with a Neo in
as long
China.
As you pay for it, you shouldn't have a problem.
Yeah. So Neo just swapped their 1 millionth battery this week, just gone, and for if you live in a multi-occupancy dwelling where there's no opportunity charging, the idea to take your car to a station and in 4 to 7 minutes a pack is taken out and a pack is put in that is healthy, has been health checked, is fully charged. That is just the done thing, and they couldn't imagine not doing that, and yet Tesla tried it, and everyone was like, "Hang on, no, it's my battery pack. I bought it with the car. I'm not swapping it out." So cultural divide as well. While we've got you, because you think about all aspects of these of the EV development, can I ask you about legislation? Do you think EVs can arrive quickly, regardless of whoever you elect this November? I mean, Norway is held up as the example of, over half, sometimes 70% of all new cars sold have a plug socket on. But that's driven by regulation legislation. Do we need that to lead, or can it be done regardless of what the policymakers decide?
We still need it. We are aiming to get to a point where we don't, but for 25 years, and still, EVs are policy driven, either carrot or stick. In Norway's case, it's the incentive. In China's case, it's a mandate. In California's case, it was a mandate, still is. Federally, we're more incentive driven. We have a CAFE fuel economy standard, but it really was the federal tax credit that helped there. So 2 aspects. Yes, we need policy. And we certainly have a desire of how things might go in November. But regardless of how that happens for the US, California right now is the center of gravity on policy. So the thing there will end up being the Supreme Court fight between the inevitable, what I think is inevitable Supreme Court fight between California and EPA if President Trump wins again. If Biden wins, I expect that fight to go away. But in the meantime, it's not a federal issue at the moment driving EVs forward. It is a state issue, and a dozen or so other states that also carbon copy what California does. So roughly 50% or more than half of the U.S. buying market is in one of these CARB states, which means that it'd be nice if we had some federal help, but it's not crucial compared to not having the state help. And that remains, somewhat different around the world, but to some degree, whether it's CO2 standards or tax incentives or whatever, yes, absolutely. People are making electric cars because these things support them. And I know that everyone kind of goes, but Tesla doesn't. And yet companies like Tesla benefit from this scheme as well, because they can sell CO2 credits and CARB credits, and infrastructure funding exists because of an industry, not because of one company. And so some of these supportive efforts won't continue to exist as much for any single company. It doesn't matter who it is. So we do still need this kind of collective aspect. But yes, until there are more models available, nationwide and nearly worldwide, until people can kind of get what they want in an EV in any form, yes, we need policy to support that. I mean, automakers have yet to decide they actually want to do this. Until that happens, we need policy. And we need advocates and enthusiasts and customers speaking up.
Yeah, I mean, it almost feels a bit unethical for me for Tesla to sell their CO2 credits to gasoline car companies, because if they didn't, they'd have to pay the fines or make the cars.
True, but for those that think that Tesla's making a better car than the companies buying the credits, there's that. And let's face it, Tesla might not exist if it wasn't for CARB credits.
Yeah.
I mean, now that's not an existential question, but there are moments where selling CARB credits help them continue to survive at all. And so, we can, yes, of course, in some ways, I would rather that companies just made EVs, but their argument is at the end of the day, you get EVs, you shouldn't care so much about who makes them, especially if those that are making and selling them are those that want to and that are making customers happy. And I get that argument too.
Yeah. I mean, California's just, is it brought the ban to 2035? Is the new...
Yeah, that's the new headline. So there's been several executive orders by Gavin Newsom and governors before him, aiming for 1.5 million EVs by 2020, and then 3 million, 5 million by 2025. So the latest version of that is banning fossil fuels by 2035, and it remains to be seen. Obviously, an executive order is not law, and we've seen this. From many countries and many areas that are saying, no gasoline, banning fossil fuels, EV only, whatever version of it they want to by X date, but no one has really codified it. So for California, what that means is that his executive order goes to the Air Resources Board, who made the original ZEV mandate, to figure out how to do these things, and it will be composed of several programs. We still have the ZEV mandate. We also now have an advanced clean trucks mandate, which addresses, class 2B and above, so medium heavy duty stuff. We have a fleet rule coming. We've got a clean miles standard for folks like Uber and Lyft and TNCs, and all of those things will end up being the building blocks of whatever this turns out to be. And so that means that, it'll take a few years until we know for sure. And there will continue to be reviews of this policy every few years. So on one hand, because we already have these laws in place, we're already sort of more codified than most of the other areas that are making these announcements. But it also means that, the headline is not necessarily the truth. And there will be some lobbying and some negotiation, and probably should be. I mean, a huge question for some of us it's things like really, really good plug-in hybrids. I don't think it's in our best interest to ban that and to go entirely pure that quickly, because there's a huge amount of the market that will go faster if we allow a little bit of flexibility, at least in the near term. And so those sorts of debates will continue to happen. But yes, that we're all on that path, and nerdy CARB meetings are in my future.
Final question from me. There are some people that would say the busiest departments of some car makers are those writing press releases and making the announcements and not actually making any of the cars,
right?
Which is fair and unfair, and I see both sides of the argument. But let's not take away any of your consulting business, but let's give some free advice to those existing car makers. There's a board meeting of VW, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and you're invited in to sit at the table. What advice would you give today to those big existing car companies?
I think most of them should dial back the press releases. I mean, I realize there's a balance of, they all want credit. We're making these billion-dollar investments in EVs. They're coming. At the same time, they don't seem to appreciate how very long we've all been hearing that. So yes, dial back it's similar to the Rivian versus, Nikola conversation, dial back some of the rhetoric a little bit, but also there's a huge amount to be learned by those that have come before. I mean, if nothing else, and I will happily route them to other consultants or people to learn from, it doesn't have to be me. There's so many things that I see repeated in terms of skin knees that could be time saved, money saved, and better results if they're more open to those conversations.
Well,
so hit us up. It's basically the advice.
Well, hopefully some of them are listening, but hopefully they're not, and they can still consult you and carry on paying for you to live.
Or watch these episodes. There's so much free information out there. It's not about the business part, but it's just, we're wasting so much time that could be better served.
Definitely. If people want to check you out, you're on Twitter at EV Chefs.
I'm EV Chelsea everywhere.
EV Chelsea, which is literally just written on your name there.
Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, it's also, occasionally.
Yeah, I'll post also in the comments and description some of the videos that we talked about today. I would just like to thank you very much. Thanks, Martin, for joining me, and we'll see you all later. Goodbye.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. See you, Chelsea.